George Williams became the main guy. Now, who is George?
Before his name became a whispered legend in West Coast circles, George, a former street figure with ties to South Los Angeles, was just another kid trying to survive the deadliest environment in America.
How was he able to go up against those guys and come out victorious like that? How was one man able to go against that many people?
Raised in the 80s during a wave of gang violence, George didn't choose the streets chose him. Unlike many who found their way into chaos through aimless rebellion, George's path was calculated. He was respected, intelligent, strategic, and quiet. The type of young man who learned early that power speaks more softly than noise. Death Row Records, founded by Suge Knight and Dr. Dre, was riding high at the time. They weren't just a label, they were a movement. Death Row represented dominance, control, and fear. And behind that empire stood Suge Knight, one of the most notorious power brokers in rap history. From strong-arm tactics to intimidation, Suge built his legacy on influence and force. But what Suge didn't expect was for someone like George to ever become a threat. It all started when George made a move Suge didn't approve of, a decision that triggered one of the most dangerous conflicts in hip-hop behind closed doors. Rumors swirled that Suge put a hit out on George, seeing him as a potential enemy. Maybe Suge thought he was shutting down a problem. Maybe he never took George seriously. But what happened next is what turned a young street hustler into Death Row's worst nightmare, and a key figure in the downfall of one of rap's most feared empires. George didn't run, he didn't hide, he organized. He built alliances in the dark, not with artists, not with executives, but with people Suge himself knew to be dangerous. George understood the streets in a way Suge didn't. Suge had muscle, George had minds. And while Death Row's financial and industry dominance allowed them to go unchecked for years, George was forming a different type of power that didn't rely on fame, only loyalty and strategy. By the time Suge realized just how poised George was to challenge him, it was already too late. The whispers about George weren't just rumors anymore, they were warnings. A man Suge ordered taken out was now moving in silence, gaining influence behind the scenes, and quietly turning allies against the Death Row machine. While artists were fighting for their masters and fans were watching the beefs unfold on TV, a much deeper war was happening out of sight, and George was the unseen commander. What started as a hit order would spark a chain reaction that exposed cracks in Death Row's armor. Suge underestimated the wrong person, and George, he became the shadow that haunted Death Row's legacy, the street strategist who refused to die, refused to fold, and turned survival into strategy. When word reached George that Suge wanted him gone, everything changed. The streets have their own ways of delivering messages, and this wasn't gossip, it was confirmation, it was personal. George knew that once Suge saw someone as a problem, there were only two outcomes, compliance or elimination. But unlike others who disappeared or fell in line under Death Row pressure, George chose retaliation, and not the kind performed with bullets, the kind that destroys empires. George began his campaign quietly, gathering intel, finding out where Death Row was weak, listening instead of reacting. Every call, every studio dispute, every late-night incident involving the label helped George build a blueprint. By studying Suge Knight, he learned the most important rule. Suge's power wasn't just from violence, it was from fear. Remove the fear and everything collapses. George wasn't alone either. He reached out to old friends who had been pushed aside by the Death Row machine. Some were family to Suge in the early days. Others were former bodyguards, associates, and producers who felt betrayed. These weren't just random alliances. They were people who knew how Death Row operated on the inside. And each one brought a piece of the puzzle that George needed to dismantle the empire. Meanwhile, Suge continued operating by brute force, confident in his status as untouchable. But what he didn't realize was that the streets don't stay loyal forever, especially when the fear disappears. Slowly, the respect Suge once commanded began shifting. The intimidation that once protected him became the very reason people turned on him. Producers started holding back music. Artists stopped returning calls. The same machine that once handed out platinum records was now barely staying together through fear alone. George deepened the psychological warfare. Instead of fighting Suge physically, he turned Suge's own tactics against him. Anonymous threats, unexpected resistance, business deals undermined from the inside. A ghost war, waged without a sound. People close to Suge whispered that someone was coming for him. That someone was George, the very man Suge once thought he eliminated. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about exposing the truth that Suge Knight's empire wasn't unbreakable. It was built on intimidation, not brotherhood, on manipulation, not loyalty. And George was the proof. All the while, the industry watched quietly as the death row structure began to crack. Big names were still dropping, but behind them, the infrastructure was falling apart. Money was missing, contacts were bailing, the FBI was paying attention, and Suge was losing control. George didn't just survive the hit, he flipped the script. He became the threat Suge never saw coming, and he was just getting started. To understand the scale of what George did, you have to understand what Death Row was. At its peak, it was the most feared label in the world. A multi-million-dollar movement that gave us Tupac, Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre, Thaw Dog Pound, and countless classics. For years, it was untouchable, and the idea of one man, a nobody from the streets, being able to disrupt it seemed impossible. But George's influence hit at the core of Death Row's biggest weakness: internal division. Suge Knight ruled with fear, not respect. The artists may have been superstars, but many felt trapped. Producers felt exploited. Friends were turned into enemies. George didn't have to fight Suge. He only had to wait while Suge's own decisions turned his team against him. The problems burst wide open when Tupac was killed in Las Vegas in 1996. The biggest star Death Row ever had was gone, and the paranoia that followed tore the label apart. Rumors spread that Pac wanted to leave. People whispered that Suge was responsible for more than he let on. The FBI began quietly investigating Death Row's finances. A silent war was already underway before George ever made his move, but he accelerated its destruction. With the beefs growing and federal heat rising, Suge was eventually sent to prison for probation violations. That was the moment George saw his opportunity. The kingpin was gone. The throne was empty. But instead of fighting for control of Death Row, George went after something bigger: the reputation, the image, the fear factor. If he could dismantle the myth of Suge Knight's power, he could destroy the legacy completely. So he did what no one thought possible. He exposed Death Row from the inside out. Associates in the music world began speaking publicly about Suge's dealings. Old stories that were once whispered became headlines. Industry insiders who once protected the label began revealing details about extortion, intimidation, and secret payments. Behind it all, George controlled the narrative through third-party voices, staying invisible, yet everywhere at once. By the time Suge got released and tried to reclaim his power, the empire had already collapsed. Artists were gone, the money was gone, the respect was gone, the game had moved on, and Death Row was nothing but a broken shell of its former self. Suge tried to restart, launch new ventures, and even revive the label under different names, but nothing worked. The fear that once made him untouchable was replaced by humiliation. George never signed a record deal, never dropped a diss track, never sat down in front of a camera. But he did what the industry said was impossible. He broke Death Row without even being signed to it, and that is what made him a nightmare. Even after Death Row fell apart, the war between George and Suge didn't end. Suge was released from prison and tried to rebuild his image through media appearances and intimidation. But something was different. He no longer had the same control over the streets. The alliances that once protected him were divided. Old friends had turned against him. Former soldiers were now calling him weak, washed, or irrelevant, and the person who sparked that shift, George. Watch any interview Suge did in the 2000s and beyond, the paranoia is visible. He constantly references people being disloyal, those trying to play with his name, or fake gangsters trying to destroy real ones. He never said George's name publicly, but insiders always knew who he was talking about. The shadow war continued, and George was already miles ahead. Instead of going public, George focused on building influence quietly. Some say he began helping young artists avoid the same traps that destroyed Death Row. Others claim he got involved in legal business and security work, warning clients about the very kinds of contracts and tactics Suge used. What once was survival turned into a mission, making sure nobody ever endured what Death Row put people through. Meanwhile, Suge faced downfall after downfall: a nightclub shooting, a hit-and-run incident, bankruptcy, multiple lawsuits, public humiliation. Eventually, in 2018, he was sentenced to 28 years in prison for voluntary manslaughter. The same intimidation he wielded for decades finally turned back against him. The world didn't fear Suge anymore, they pitied him. George didn't have to fight the man physically, he fought the myth and won. What made it even more mysterious was how George stayed silent. No interviews, no books, no documentaries, no public beef. By never stepping into the spotlight, he controlled the story without becoming part of it. The real enemy of Death Row wasn't a rival label or a diss track, it was a survivor with strategy. And that's why the legend of George lives on. In rooms where rappers and executives talk about the old days, his name comes up like a warning. Not to cross the wrong people, not to confuse violence with power, not to underestimate the ones who operate without fame. To this day, many refer to George as the one man Suge couldn't break, threaten, or erase. He became the ghost of Death Row, the reminder that empires built on fear eventually collapse on themselves. And the last thing Suge Knight ever wanted was to know his biggest nightmare was alive and outsmarting him at every turn. What makes this story so wild isn't just that Suge Knight targeted someone. That was normal. It's that he targeted the wrong person. George didn't just survive the hit. He dismantled an empire that the entire music industry was terrified of. And he did it without ever dropping a song or signing a deal. This story reveals one of the biggest truths in the music world. Power doesn't just come from fame. It comes from intelligence, patience, and knowing the game better than the ones who think they control it. Suge ran his operation with force, but force alone doesn't win wars. George ran his operation with strategy, timing, and silence. And silence is deadlier than any diss record ever made. Death Row was legendary, but inside it was fragile. Artists were miserable, contracts were predatory, money was disappearing. Suge's ego was bigger than the business. Once his reign was challenged, not by a rival label but a single man he underestimated, it exposed everything underneath the glamour: manipulation, fear, and broken trust. George exposed how power built on fear dies fast. How the streets may follow you when there's money but abandon you when the walls close in. How empires crumble when the foundation is built on intimidation instead of loyalty. Suge Knight wasn't just fighting the law, he was fighting karma. The legacy of Death Row will always include Tupac's brilliance, Dr. Dre's genius, and Snoop Dogg's legendary come-up, but it will also include the dark side, the lawsuits, the fear, and the downfall. And in that story, there exists a shadow most people don't know, the man who outplayed the biggest villain in hip-hop history. Today, Suge Knight sits in a California state prison, telling stories from the past. Death Row has been resold multiple times. Snoop now owns it, trying to rebuild the legacy. But the world that once feared Suge Knight doesn't exist anymore. The era is gone. The empire is dust. And the streets, they still know the truth. The person Suge wanted dead outsmarted him, survived him, and outlived him. George didn't become a rap star. He didn't chase clout. He didn't write a tell-all. Instead, he turned pain into purpose. His story became a teaching tool for young artists tempted by the glamour of the industry. He became a quiet mentor to those who saw what happened to DOA, YSL, BMF, and Death Row, warning them that fame without protection is just a setup. His story is rarely told out loud because the industry doesn't like stories where the villain loses. But on the streets, George is respected for one reason. He stayed alive, stayed quiet, and stayed dangerous without lifting a single weapon. He turned his name into a legend, not by being seen, but by being feared. And Suge Knight, he learned too late that some enemies are invisible. Some revenge doesn't need violence. Some threats don't need guns. George didn't become a rapper, he became a blueprint, a way to survive the cycle, a walking contradiction to the idea that the loudest man is the most powerful. He became the one thing Death Row could never intimidate, the ghost in the system. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more untold hip-hop stories, street history breakdowns, and deep dive narratives the industry doesn't want you to hear.